Hmm. Sorry, just a sec. Just got to make sure my slides are showing here. Do you want to give me a thumbs up? That's okay. I'm working okay. Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, thanks everybody for coming out tonight. And I'm going to cover a few different things off here for you in terms of the course that I teach on animal geography. And I know this is supposed to be a sampler for you about the kinds of things you might learn. And I'm hoping that you might be interested in geography after you see this talk tonight. So I called this Through Wolf Eyes because I wanted to sort of portray for you how we look at doing wolf conservation and how we do that differently as geographers. And so these are some of the things I teach in my animal geography course, which is called Geography 430, if you're interested in that in the future. And so tonight, what I want to focus on is understanding the world of wild wolves and using different methods that we would use in geography. I'm going to focus on a variety of different canid species from the wild, including gray wolves, painted dogs from Africa, and coyotes. And the topics that I want to cover off in relation to that are science, technology, the methods that we use, and then the things I call the immeasurables. So first, I want to talk to you about coastal wolves. So coastal wolves are a special wolf that lives on the BC coast of Canada. And what's really cool about these is that the species itself, the genetic work that's been done on these has shown that they're actually more genetically diverse as this solo population than all of the gray wolves in the world. And there's some thinking that maybe they were isolated on the coast of BC just before the Ice Age happened here about 12,000 years, or sorry, it ended about 12,000 years ago, but that they were isolated up until that time. So they're a really special wolf that actually navigates between all of the islands out on the BC coast. And some of them have been documented to swim up to 14 kilometers to get from island to island. And one of the important things about this place is that the islands themselves aren't written into the management and conservation plans. And so as a result, they can be heavily logged and habitat that is important for those species can be disturbed. So the objective of that particular study that we did was to determine the factors that affect the wolf occurrence, their abundance, their distribution across that BC coast, and learn a little bit about their behavior and conservation. And this particular objective is going to come up again in each of the examples that I give you tonight. We're interested in coastal wolves because they are unique and because we want to try to maintain those habitats that will allow them to persist in time and hold those genetics for us into the future. So when we're doing an analysis like this, what we have to do is look at the occurrence of that species versus the habitat. And so this is the geography we're looking at here. So we look at the topographical characteristics. So if any of you have worked with the, a topographic map for orienteering, or that's the kind of thing we're talking about with topography. The spatial attributes that I'm going to talk about are things like the shape of the island and that. And then the biological aspects are what's there for them to eat, or what habitat's there for them to live in. And then we'll talk a little bit about their lived experience as well. I don't know why this isn't moving forward. Sorry, I'm having a little trouble moving my slides forward. There we go. So first of all, the methods that we use when we do this kind of research, I focused on non-invasive methods. There's different ways that we can do this when we study wildlife, but I moved away from using radio collars simply because you have to trap the animal and handle it, and that causes some issues for that animal sometimes. So when we're using this form of sampling, on the side of that image, you can see there's some tracks, there's an observation, there's what we call scat, or the feces that's left behind. And we use those to figure out whether the animal is present or not on an island. And in most habitat analyses that we do, we're looking at the presence of that animal, and when we have to analyze it using the statistics, we consider that either the animal's present, it's a 1, or it's absent, it's a 0. And I'm not going to get into all the math around and statistics around that because that would probably not be all that interesting for you tonight. But I want to try to paint a picture of 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 how we do this, and for you to see that, you know, it's something that you can also learn how to do fairly quickly and easily. So then we have, do the animals or do the wolves live or not on certain islands? And then there's these characteristics of those islands. So how, you know, how much of the island is really steep habitat? What kinds of slope are there? So is it really steep slope? And the aspect is something that we get out of elevation maps that tells us what direction is the slope facing. And so, for example, if you're looking at a south-facing slope, they tend to be more dry in the summertime, and they get snow-free earlier, and so those can sometimes be better for wildlife. Under the category of spatial, you'll see things like the island area, the shape of the island, the distance that island is to a mainland source where the wolves might live and swim from, and then the distance to a nearest island. And this is all part of something called island biogeography theory. And that's something that was done in the 1950s, where they looked at how do animals move between islands and colonize islands and that. And these were the metrics that were important. And then the last, I won't go through all of these, but there's biological measurements we want to look at for each of those islands. So how many other mammals are there? Mammal richness, say prey richness. How many different species of prey are there? And then things that are important from a management standpoint are things like logged, the percentage of that island that's logged. So all this stuff we can get from things like satellite data, from digital source maps, some of it from Google Maps that you might be able to download. And then we have to turn it into something useful to analyze. So if you're interested in sort of the technology, this is really a cool way to get into the field of doing the work, right? And it's also really important, and it's one of the ways that we've revolutionized how we do wildlife research. This is just one example of how we might use a Landsat satellite, which is one type of satellite that's up there. And we get a digital image that comes from that provides us with what we call reflectance of the land. And that just tells us information about what kinds of plant species are there, or are there no plant species. And this is just an example of how we might transform that into something usable. And so on the one side, and I'm not going to go into all the details on this, you can ask questions, of course, but wetness is something we describe from that. And wetness tells us how complex is that forest? How hard is it to move through? Greenness tells us about how productive is that? And that productivity then is connected to how many animals live there and how many prey species might live there. So we do this for every one of those variables that I talked about, and we have to combine all that together into an analysis. And so in terms of how we do this analysis, on this image here, on this slide here, you'll see the dependent variable, that's the wolf occurrence. The independent data is habitat metrics. We use regression. And again, you don't need to worry about the details here, but our end goal is we want to know something about why do wolves want to swim to one island and not another. And so at the bottom here, you see, on the right-hand side, you'll see sort of the input images. Then those become a database. So you see the area of an island, the shape of an island. Is the wolf there? One. Is it not there? 0. What's the name of the island? So when we run this analysis, then we get an output that's statistical. But what that then lets us do is, as a manager, go back in and create a surface that'll tell us where, like the red spots here on this map, where are we most likely to find wolves? And that's really critical for making management decisions that affect the lives of species. So this is an example oops, this is an example of output. And yeah, it looks messy and it's just a bunch of numbers, but I want to talk a little bit about it. Many of you will have seen this if you've done some basic, t-tests or regression tests in your science classes. But in the end, when we do all this work and we did all this analysis, we found out that wolves have a positive relationship with the shape of an island. So um, the more sort of complex the shape of that island, the more likely they are to go there. And that's because there's more points for them. I'm going to turn my camera on in case you can see me, but like your hand, instead of it being a round ball, if you think about an island in the ocean that has just like all sheer edges, it's not going to be as easy to get there. Whereas if it has a whole bunch of points, there might be like shallow areas they can get there. Then there's distance to the other nearest island. So that makes sense, of course, because the closer that island is, the more likely they'll be there. And then a negative relationship to the distance to mainland. So the farther it is away, the less likely the wolf is going to be there. And positive relation to area. So the bigger the area of the island, the more likely they're going to see it and get there. But what was really cool about this analysis is it showed that last variable there, a negative relationship to the amount of logged area. And so that means that a certain amount of logging is going to make that island unuseful for wolves. And if we're trying to conserve them, then we need to do something different about how we manage it, right? So what can we do with this kind of output? Yeah, it's a complicated a regression equation. But what this allows us to do is build a map that says which islands, where's the critical habitat, which islands are important to protect, and that helps us conserve forests and all those species. The next example I want to give you is about Rocky Mountain wolves. And you'll notice these are also called Canis canis as there's Canis lupus, both of the coastal and the Rocky Mountain or Canis lupus. And so they just happen to be different cultures of wolves. So this is from work that I did a long time ago, but looking at how wolves relate to roads. But again, how do we study these as somebody who's trying to understand how do we fix this for animals so that we can manage them? And one of the big deals in the mountain environments or anywhere where you've got large carnivores is highways end up killing animals. And so I don't want to dwell on this slide, but there's a couple of reasons for that. One is the direct barrier effect. So the animal can't make it across. And the second is an indirect barrier effect, which they're afraid to go out on that road. And from a genetic standpoint, if you fracture that population over time, you're going to lose genetic variation and you're going to end up either losing that population or having negative effects of that inbreeding. And so we want to try to fix that situation. So this is another part of a discipline within geography called landscape ecology. And that's about looking at that landscape and saying, okay, it used to be all connected. And then we punched a road through it, which is now causing animals not to be able to go for one reason or the other. And our job is to figure out where should we put something that can restore that. So some of you from here might have gone through Banff and you would have seen those crossing structures. And that's what this work was originally devised to do, is to help identify where do we put that. So I did a whole bunch of snow tracking and then combined that with the same kinds of satellite images like greenness, wetness, elevation, aspect, slope, did the same kind of analysis I just walked you through. And then we used that to predict where should we put crossing structures. And so in this map, what you see, and this is called the geospatial analysis. And what's cool about this too, what I really like is there's an art to it, right? There's an art to making these maps and making them look good. So if you're very, oriented in that way, it gives you an opportunity to express yourself, right? So what this map shows you on the legend, you can see the single species, cougar, lynx, marten, wolf, or the double species, cougar and lynx, cougar and marten, all the way down to the red and orange sites, which are all the species. So I studied 13 species when I did this, not just wolves. But what this map was designed to do is allow us to say, look at the color and go right away, where are the hot spots that we want to make sure we have a crossing structure? So you look at the map and you go, wherever there's red or orange, that's where we want to put a crossing structure. And so this can then go to the managers to find out, well, what would be the optimal choice to put that crossing structure? And then you'd have to have the engineers come in and tell you whether you can build it there or not. But what I love about this particular design of the color scheme is that you can pretty quickly identify any individual species you want. So if you want, oh, I just want to know where cougar crossed the road, then you just go for the light purple colors, right? And so it's a nice way to figure this out. And there's all sorts of courses that help you learn how to make these maps. So what are the uses there? If we zoom in on that image, you can see the red zone there. That's where we want to make sure we capture movement for all species. Well, what I can then say to the managers is, where that red area is, you got to put something big like this crossing, this big open span. But where there's little tiny sort of areas like this narrower red zone, we might be able to capture that movement for all those animals with a smaller thing, like those overpasses that you might see on the highway. Now we're going to fly over to Africa and talk about painted dogs. So Lycaon pictus. So they actually go by a bunch of different names, one of which is African wild dog. And this was the name painted dog was given to them because pictus is basically about painting, painted. But it was really a marketing ploy because African wild dog sounded not, sound a little more threatening than painted dogs. These are one of the most critical endangered species on the planet. There are about 3,000, 5,000 left in the world. And so I got to go work with them in Zimbabwe to look at a variety of things like that habitat work I just did. Because you've seen that, I'm not going to go over that again, but we did that kind of analysis. But we did other things like look at where are the home ranges for different families. So here's another example of how we use GIS and a bunch of point data to actually figure out, in this first image here in 1991, on the left-hand side, sorry, you can see the white is one of the family's home ranges, and the red is another family's home range. And so what we can do with this is understand, where are they moving? Do they interact? Do they get along? Do they have like tight territories? Do they defend those territories? How much area do we need to increase the number of animals so they don't go extinct? And then we can also do things like over time, that's what's on this image is, over time, how did those different families change how they use the area? And you'll notice we have them labeled as pack 1, pack 2, whatever. And really the language on this has changed, and we call them families now, because they all have, there's a mother, a father, and then there's several offspring. And there might be aunts and uncles that are in that family as well and stay together. Really cool fact about painted dogs is that they are what we call eusocial. And that means they're the top of the social order of all of the canids. And when they make decisions every day, every animal in the family, and the families range, from about 3 to 19 animals, they all have to agree that they're going to get up and go on the hunt that day. And the way, and they also, every animal has to greet every other animal every morning. So it's quite a big show. And I can't talk too much about those because I want to cover off a few other things, but very, very cool species. And again, geography, GIS, and students who are interested in conservation, you will make a difference in protecting endangered species if you get involved in this kind of stuff. The last thing I want to talk about is a little local, close to home. And you might think, well, these aren't really wolves, but in fact, Canis latrans is actually the barking dog. And you'll see it's also a canis as a species. And the other name that they went by was painted wolves. Sorry, sorry, prairie wolves early on. So this study, we used a variety of things. I used geographic information systems, or GIS, SCAD, tracks, and also involved citizen science and a media content analysis. So I want to show you the breadth of methods that you might be able to use when you do conservation. Hopefully these are of interest to you. So we went out and collected scat, 500 scats. We did this 2 different time periods. And we looked at, for the coyotes, what are they eating in the city of Calgary? And then, we graph it all out. And I'm not going to, again, dwell on this graph because graphs aren't always that interesting. But at the bottom of this graph, you see the types of things we identified in the diet, from plants to crab apples to small mammals, over to anthropogenic food sources and domestic animals. And so what we were able to do with this was, it was the first study done like this. We were able to start to tell people about, what, how many animals are coyotes actually eating? How many domestic pets are coyotes actually eating? And how frequently is that happening? Because in the media, the people will say, oh, they're happening all the time. So this shows here that 1.2% of the scats contained pet remains versus 85% of the scats contained small mammals, the tallest graph there. So this helps us know that for the time being, at least when this was happening, most coyotes were eating what they should in the city, which is great. From a management standpoint, you'll see the crabapple was pretty high. And so what happens is they will eat the fruit that falls from the trees. And so we made a management recommendation following this to clean up all fallen fruit or don't plant crab apples. And you might know that in the town of Banff and in the town of Canmore, the town of Banff specifically, they're taking out all of those crab apple trees just because they bring different animals in that we don't want there, like carnivores that can get into conflict. And in Canmore, they're encouraging that as well. So if you plant things like crab apples, they're likely to bring animals like coyotes into your yard. And so we made a recommendation based on this. And so again, what's really, I think, important here is, as a student or in geography or someone learning how to do this kind of analysis, you have direct influence on the management of these animals and in conflict resolution. And so, but what was really strange about the crab apples, of course, was then we got some citizen science data that came in, you'll see in a minute, that kind of threw that into the under the bus. So what this also helps us do is identify what we call attractants, and those are the things like garbage. So in that previous image, there was about 14% of the scat had garbage in it, and that's what we call attractants. And the challenge with attractants is attractants lead to habituation of carnivores, and especially coyotes in cities. And then food conditioning on top of that. So if you're actually going out and somebody's throwing food at coyotes or other animals, that then teaches them to depend on people and to engage in what we call demand behavior. So they'll walk up and ask for that food, and that creates conflict. But when I did an analysis of all of the attacks, which are very, very few in Canada, approximately 3 people are bitten or scratched in Canada per year by a coyote. 100% of those attacks link back to food conditioning. So understanding, how much our coyote population is getting into those attractants is an important contribution to management. And we do that by using those non-invasive methods. And things that you might think about for your own backyard are things like garbage, birdseed, compost, pet food, feral cats or free roaming cats, and other people in your neighborhood may be feeding other wildlife that attracts in things like coyotes. And then homeless encampments can provide food as well. And like I said, one of the things that's pretty cool about citizen science is we made this recommendation that people should clean up their crab apples, but then somebody said, I think you better rethink that because coyotes are actually in some areas climbing the trees. So this is pretty amazing. Someone sent this video in, and this coyote's up about 11, 12 feet in the air and picking these crab apples off of the tree in wintertime. And then it saw the person videoing and then jumped down and took off. We used GIS in 2 different studies here. On the left-hand side, we used GIS from Calgary 311 data, and the red spots show you all of Calgary where the high conflict is. You might not know Calgary, but wherever your city is, you can use this kind of approach to identify where should we maybe go on the ground and take a look and see what's happening. Are they getting into garbage there? Why is there conflict there? Lots of free-running pets. What's going on? We used citizen reports. We made a GIS where people could log in and do their own reporting. And you see there was fairly similar pattern of the red zones happening sort of on the peripheral of the city of Calgary in the second time we did it. We also took all of those reports from citizens and from 311, and we could identify what time of year is important. So we found that season was important. And I'll get you to just disregard the level 2, 3, 4 or low level, but just look at level 5 here. And what we were able to do was show that in the pup rearing, the red, so that's right now, was the highest conflict time. So that helps us know when do we really need to put more effort in and what do we need to do to help people coexist with coyotes at that time. And the second one is during dispersal, so that's October. And again, it just helps us understand better. And the last I want to talk about is immersive tracking, or that I do, where I'm really following them intensively for coyotes in the city. And I don't advise you do this. This is me with my head stuck in a den. It's really not something you should do unless you're trained to do it. But what I wanted to do was really learn these animals and how they saw the landscape. So I call it immersive research. And through that, I want to touch based on just a few cool things that we found evidence of. They have purposeful monogamy. So coyotes actually also live in families and they bond. Some people will, sometimes refer to this as a married couple, but they stay together until, one may accidentally get killed. That would be the only way that they would separate through their lives. Secondly, they engage in what we call alloparenting. So this is one of the families I studied. The mom, the dad, and then usually a babysitter who's a younger sister or brother will stay and look after the puppies. So those are called non-parental caregivers. And this is one of the babysitters, and their relationship is totally, so I can find from the cameras that I had on them that their relationships are totally different between puppies and parent caregivers and puppies and adults. We see that the puppies actually recognize each other differently, and they actually recognize their parents, and they recognize when a coyote is not a member of their family. We see them being very curious, and that can of course get them into trouble. That's a coyote pup with somebody threw a stuffy to it. We see them engaged in things like imitation. So here you see the young pup is imitating its father. And imitation, and they're actually looking at a human that's coming in the other way. And through this process, the pup learns that when my dad looks that direction, there's something to be concerned about. And it's the same process that humans go through. And it's the way we understand whether, that how we differentiate people and humans as having the capacity to um, be self-aware and be aware of their surroundings, and it's part of the theory of mind. So this is important evidence that these animals have higher levels of thinking. We also see evidence of complex vocalizations and language in these guys, and we find that they have emotional lives. And those emotional lives and the conflict that they might get in trying to live in a city, and they might get injured, this we see creates a landscape of fear, panic, and pain for these animals. And so I look at how do we try now, I look at how do we try to address this so that we minimize that kind of fear, because fear leads to conflict. The more that we have animals with their young, like people, if it was their, a mom and dad with their kids, the more that they're facing threatening situations, the more anxious they get, and the more likely there's conflict. And the same thing happens with coyotes. And so I have taken all of this work and I engage in what we call applied science as well, or outreach. And we created a program that, I'd love you to go take a look at later, called UCalgary Living with Wildlife, where we apply science as the basis for management. But that involves 4 pillars. Monitoring, that's the science of monitoring. Education, that's the translation of the science to people. Enforcing is having some security go in and make sure people have dogs on leash and stuff. And mitigation is learning how to communicate with those animals so that you can teach them, if they start getting too close to people, you can teach them to go away. So you can look that up online if you want. UCalgary Living with Wildlife. It's on the web site research.ucalgary.ca/wildlife. So I don't want to take the full hour because I want to open us up for questions, but I want to note that all of the above research that I talked about is quantitative, really. So this is about looking at how, what are the attributes of how many animals are there, where do they live, what's the amount of habitat they need, and this is really essential to management and conservation. But when it comes to understanding animals, there are gaps that still exist. And these are about how do animals perceive the world? And these are the things that, that are not quantifiable to us. And any of you familiar with Dr. Seuss might have heard the expression that he used, which was, not everything that can be counted counts. And we have not done a really good job yet. And science as a practice isn't really good at accepting these things that we can't count. And I want to close on an example of these things that we can't just count and figure out by having a collar on an animal or by knowing where it's living or what kind of food it likes to eat. And this is a story about a wolf that I studied it was the first wolf I studied in Banff National Park. And her name was Diane, and she was the matriarch of that family. And I started studying in 1991, and coincidentally, she had just been ousted. So she was the reproducing female up until 1991. And that spring, she got booted out of the pack because, because I'll tell you in a minute, but this happens. They can only maintain a certain family size, after which it gets too difficult to get enough food to maintain that family size. So it's like 5 to 7 animals, 7 to 9, depending on where you are. And so someone has to go. And unfortunately, if she was weak, it turned out later she was sick, but she was outcast, and she was living a long distance away as sort of a outcast. And her daughter took over as the reproducing female in 1991. And because the daughter wasn't radio collared, they lost track of where she was and where those pups might be. And as a new matriarch, she's going to be leading the next families that come along. But about 4 weeks into 4 weeks after she had denned and had her pups, she was killed on the Trans-Canada Highway in Banff. So they found her, or we found her killed on the road, and knew because she was lactating that she was the new female. But that also meant that her pups at that point in time, because they reproduce exactly the same time every year, that her pups were now without a mother. And that means that they would have there'd be no lactation, no milk. They wouldn't be able to survive. Now, Diane herself was about 100 to 200 kilometers away when her daughter was killed on the highway. She was well down into Kootenay National Park, over 100 kilometers away when that death happened. And within 48 hours, she was back in the Bow Valley and she raised those pups. And the only way she raised those pups was if she spontaneously lactated. And so this shows us about the amazing things that these animals are capable of. For one, the spontaneous lactation to take over. But the big question that remains is, how did she know? How does a wolf who's 100 to 200 kilometers away know that she's alone? How does she know she needs to come back, that there's an urgent need for her to come back? And these are the things I call the immeasurables. These are the things we haven't done a good job figuring out yet, and we really need to learn them. When we need to learn them in order to improve coexistence, but I think when we learn about those, we learn more about people, and we learn more about, how are we going to address challenges in the future? How do we measure things we can't see? Whoops, sorry, click. So we need new thinkers, because most of us who are doing this work, we've learned how to do it one way, and we're trying to push into other ways, but we need new students. We need students like you to get involved and to be the next generation of researchers who help us find the better solutions. So thanks for your time, and I'm happy to take questions now. And if you want to look at more of the research that we do in my lab, you can go to the Instagram at Canid Lab. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Shelley. I'm just going to share my screen quickly and just go through a quick presentation on my end. So if you've seen some of these sample lectures before, you're probably familiar with this presentation, but basically we're just going to go through a little bit more on admission requirements and just UCalgary in general. So how do you start your journey towards the University of Calgary? So this is just a little bit about UCalgary at a glance. So we were founded in 1966. We have about 28,000 undergraduate students, 5 campuses, and 14 faculties. And that's a lot to say when when we're not even 100 years old yet. We are also Canada's entrepreneurial university, and we have about $504 million in sponsored research funding a year. We have 94% after graduation employment rate, and then my favorite statistic is the 95% undergraduate retention rate. So that retention rate basically shows the student life satisfaction on campus. So 95% of students who come to us for their first year will stay with us for their entire degree. So again, that just speaks to student life satisfaction, the different things that we offer at UCalgary. So this is just a little bit about the admissions information for UCalgary to get into our undergraduate programs. So we're going to be looking at 5 faculty-specific classes, and these are going to be ones that are it's going to be competitive. So we're going to be looking at your admissions average. Some of them have supplemental applications. So we have the Bachelor of Health Sciences, which has a written piece, we have an audition, and we have a portfolio. And then all students must demonstrate ELP, which is English Language Proficiency. This is specific to the geography program. So as you can see, the Bachelor of Science/Arts, there's 2 different options. You can either go into a science-based degree or an arts-based degree in geography. So we're looking for English, Alberta Mathematics 30-1 or 30-2, or equivalent, which basically means if you're taking a -1 or -2 equivalent class out of province or out of country, we're going to be looking at that one. 2 approved courses and then an approved course or option. Both of these are going to be in the mid-70s that we're going to be looking at. So we're going to be looking at an overall admissions average of those 5 classes. Then these are just some important dates that we're looking at for 2024, 2025. So for anybody who has gained admission for fall 2024, who's here tonight, you probably are familiar with this deadline chart. But for anybody not familiar, this is going to basically take you through the entire pathway to getting an offer to the University of Calgary. The big ones to remember are October 1 for domestic applications open, and then August 1 for international applications. And then our deadline is March 1st. So those ones are kind of the important ones. The one that's upcoming is our decision deadline. So if anybody has an offer that's with us tonight, make sure to go in and accept that offer by that May 1 deadline in order to have that offer confirmed. And then these are just a couple of ways to connect with us. So we have all of our social medias here on the side, as well as our general email, I would call it. We also have a podcast and a Pinterest and a YouTube. So after the lecture tonight, all of our sample lectures are going to be posted to our YouTube channel for you to go back and watch later. You can connect with a recruiter for your specific region here at this QR code on the left-hand side of the screen. And then if you'd like to see our current view book, it's just the QR code in the middle of the screen. So just a couple of ways to stay in contact with us after tonight. And then that's all I have for you tonight. So if you have any questions for Shelley, please feel free to put them in the chat. I will also be answering questions in the chat. So if you have any admissions questions or general university life questions, please feel free to put those in there and I'll make sure to answer them just off mic here. But Shelley is more than happy to answer any questions that you have about wildlife conservation and that amazing presentation that she gave.
Calgary living with wildlife, so not seeing any.
Sorry, I just had a technical difficulty on my end, but we're back again. So I hopped on it really quickly, but we're back and running. Have we gotten any questions in the chat, Shelley?
No, not yet. No, so I just did I get shut off too? Did everybody
No,
get?
it looks
Yeah,
like you are
okay.
still running. We're
Yeah.
still,
No,
everything's
that's fine.
still
You
running.
know, I just said folks can drop me a line if they want to my email. So yeah, no questions. And thanks everyone for attending. That was a great opportunity.
Yes, thank you so much. I really appreciated having you on tonight. And I'm sure all the students really appreciated it as well.
You're welcome.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.